Well, as the Trump administration spends billions in taxpayer dollars to buy up ownership stakes in private companies like Intel, for instance, the president is also making sure that he personally profits from this. So I have mixed feelings about this story, mainly because Trump is getting a lot of flack from members of the left and right in regard to his administration's tactic here, in which the federal government, buys ownership stakes in various private companies. I like that. I don't think he deserves flack for that, because I think it makes a lot more sense to stop forcing Americans to provide their taxpayer dollars for grants for these corporations, which they never benefit from, of course. We never benefit when our government just hands over money to various corporations or subsidies to various corporations. How about if we're giving you money, we should own some of the stakes here, right? And so I like that Trump is doing this, but what I always wondered about was what's in it for him? What is in it for him? Because everything else Trump has done as president, both in his first term and second term, has made clear to me that he doesn't do anything unless he himself is going to personally benefit from it. And now we have our answer thanks to this pretty incredible expose written by the New York Times. So let's get to the nitty-gritty. So this revelation was reported in a new piece in the New York Times, which highlights the Trump administration's somewhat unusual snapping up of ownership shares in private companies. So more than $10 billion in taxpayer funds have already been spent buying stakes in firms the government has deemed important to national security. I think semiconductor chips is a perfect example of that. So the government's growing portfolio of corporate ownership involves minority stakes or the option to take them in the future in at least 9 companies involved in steel, minerals, nuclear energy, and semiconductors. So to me, that makes sense. And that, in my opinion, goes along with the narrative that the president is trying to sell to us, that these are items that are important to America and our national security, and they should be manufactured here in the United States. So Intel was really struggling. And when the government under Trump came in and essentially started buying shares of Intel, yes, he helped to save Intel, but I thought that was an important thing to do because we do want to manufacture semiconductor chips here rather than abroad, right? So as the Times explains, some officials are hopeful the equity stakes will generate a windfall for taxpayers, but the likelihood of that is unclear. Many of the companies are facing financial headwinds and some could take years to become profitable. So 3 months ago, we did talk about the largest deal to date, and that was when the federal government took a 10% stake in Intel in exchange for $8.9 billion in taxpayer money. Now, Intel is a chip maker, and it's been struggling to keep up with competitors. I should note, one of the things that annoyed me about the Intel situation here is that rather than investing in innovation, they did spend quite a bit of money on corporate stock buybacks to artificially inflate the value of their shares. But nonetheless, Trump comes in and he offers $8.9 billion in taxpayer money. So we as a country now have a 10% stake in Intel. Now again, I'd rather do that than just hand over the money and not have any ownership of Intel at all. So we'll see how Intel performs moving forward, but that was the thinking. At least that's what Trump said his thinking was when it came to this decision. Now, the government argued that funding Intel in exchange for equity was necessary for national security, since chips, of course, are used in many industries, including telecommunications, the automotive industry, even medicine. And they hoped that propping up Intel would help bring the manufacturing of semiconductor chips back to the United States. Now, the decision, as I mentioned earlier, was met with a lot of backlash on both sides of the political aisle. And they're essentially accusing President Donald Trump of engaging in socialist policy, because of course they are. But so far, I have no problem with what the Trump administration is doing. The problem comes in when it becomes clear that this isn't really about ensuring that American taxpayers, own shares of these companies that need help in order to survive. It looks like it's a little bit of a pumping and enriching yourself type situation when it comes to the value of these shares. So let's get to the details on that. What we didn't know at the time at least, was that Trump was angling to profit himself. So a public filing from the Office of Government Ethics shows that shortly after that agreement was made, President Trump personally purchased between $1 million and $5 million worth of Intel's corporate debt. So here we're talking about bonds, okay? In other words, Trump is parlaying his own public policy into a payday for himself. So he'll receive interest payments from Intel until the corporate bond he bought, meaning the debt that he bought, matures and the principal is repaid. And while the taxpayer-funded infusion of cash, in the meantime, that taxpayer-funded infusion of cash is going to essentially help Intel boost its profits. So on August 25th, he posted on Truth Social, quote, "I love seeing their," he loves to tell on himself, doesn't he? "I love seeing their stock price go up, making the USA richer and richer." He's making himself richer, let's be clear about that. Then he purchased the Intel bonds on August 29th. So he makes that post August 25th, then he purchases the bonds August 29th. So while that was the most direct evidence of, let's just keep it real, a corrupt act in these ownership deals, there are some subtle examples I can give you as well, and they are outlined in the New York Times piece. So for instance, in early November, the government announced an equity deal with Vulcan Elements, which is a North Carolina-based startup making rare earth magnets. They call them magnets. No one's ever used that word before, magnets. So the company offered the government equity and warrants in return for $50 million from the Commerce Department and $620 million from the Defense Department. The company has received investment from several venture funds, including 1789 Capital, where the president's son, Donald Trump Jr., is a partner. Seems like a little bit of a conflict of interest, no? Maybe a little bit. But anyway, Trump is profiting off companies that are receiving government contracts. That's basically what the heart of this story is. So according to new financial disclosures, Trump bought up to $6 million worth of corporate bonds in Boeing. And according to the documents, Trump bought between $1 million and $5 million worth of Boeing bonds on August 28th. On September 19th, he bought more Boeing bonds worth between $500,000 and $1 million. And while he's been investing in Boeing, the Defense Department has been doling out multi-billion-dollar contracts to them. In March, Trump announced that Boeing would receive a $20 billion development contract for the F-47 fighter jets. I mean, because poor Boeing. Well, I mean, what else would Boeing be able to do without the help of government cheese, right? Without the help of these investors. And look, private investors, retail investors, you want to invest in Boeing, there's no law against that. But what I'm having issue with here is that it seems as though Trump is using taxpayer money to help increase the value of the shares for these corporations that he is also investing in simultaneously. You get what I'm saying? It's a scheme to enrich himself and to increase his own return on investment. And Trump isn't stopping at Intel and Boeing, of course. So he's bought bonds for Meta, Home Depot, CVS Health, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, United Health Group. In the meantime, unemployment is increasing pretty rapidly. There's some new reporting out about tens of thousands of people losing their jobs every month at the same time, cutting interest rates in response to growing unemployment is supposed to help, but it's not helping, meaning that we're entering, stagflation, which is pretty disastrous for our economy. So a lot of Americans are feeling the pain in their pocketbooks, especially as the holidays are happening already. I mean, Thanksgiving is tomorrow. So like my heart breaks for what's happening in the country. And in the meantime, these deals are kind of being sold to the American people as a big win for US taxpayers. But the real motive here isn't about doing what's best for American taxpayers. It's about inflating the value of the shares for these companies, which again, Trump is simultaneously investing in. All firms, by the way, all the firms that I listed earlier do stand to gain from government handouts and deregulation. So in total, Trump appears to have bought at least $185 million worth of corporate and municipal bonds since the start of his presidency. Fun. So that's what we're dealing with here, folks. And I think as these stories come out, they're starting to pack more of a punch than they had in Trump's first term. Because you can't present yourself as America first when you're using the office of the presidency to enrich yourself as the American people struggle economically. You can't claim to be America first when your priorities seem to be on other foreign countries as opposed to doing what's best to represent the American people and alleviate some of the economic pain that they are struggling with at the moment. So we'll see what the reaction or response would be to a story like this from Trump's own base. But make no mistake about it, if this were any other administration, any other president, this is a massive scandal. But when it's Trump, it's barely a blip on the radar.
Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.